Yeah.
All right, everyone. I know that this is going to be a small, intimate group. Thank you for coming to this 11 o'clock panel called Why So Critical? A discussion on film criticism and horror. My name is Michael Byers. I'll be moderating this panel today. So the reason I wanted to do this panel, for those of you who may or may not know me, I am an avid film nerd. I've been doing a critical analysis film podcast for the last 7 years called The Shameless Picture Show, where the whole concept of the show is that me and my guest, we sit down with a movie, preferably that one of us haven't seen, to one, open our eyes to something, and then two, to sit down and talk with it, because there's a lot of times where you don't want to admit that you haven't seen a certain movie, so this kind of gives you a no judgment zone. But by doing this show, it gave me a very different relationship with the world of film criticism, as I went to school for filmmaking. And anyone who has spent any time in academic film world knows this is a very simplistic analogy, but there are two camps when you go to school for film. You're either a jock or you're a nerd. You're either the really hands-on person who wants to make things, or you are the person who wants to dig down deeper and understand it. But there are also people who like doing both. And so doing my podcast has given me a very different relationship with film criticism, and I have been trying to spread the love for the art that is film criticism. Now getting to the point of this panel, horror has traditionally been pretty maligned critically, yet it, from a fan standpoint, they have a very adamant love for it. So I kind of wanted to dig down to why that is, and I pitched this panel, and here we are. So we have a great panel of judges, and I'm going to pass the microphone down and have them introduce themselves. And while you're introducing yourself, I also want you to answer, what is your relationship with horror?
Hello, I am Tom Fuchs, a film writer. I've written for too long about film. Website called chud.com. I don't know if anybody remembers it from like decades ago at this point. On Milwaukee, writing for Milwaukee Film as well. And my relationship to horror was the question.
Yes.
It's not a fraught one, but I came to it possibly a little later than anyone else on the panel. I had a recurring nightmare as a child of Freddy Krueger, where I would be alone in my house, and then he would capture me and tickle me, and then I would wake up. So that alone was enough to I'm not down with horror. I don't want to be tickled by Freddy. Until I was, I'd say, 16, perhaps, when my father was like, there's nothing. We went and saw Scream 3. We saw Scream 3 in theaters, and then I realized, this is fine. This isn't the stuff of nightmares necessarily. And then I fell completely into it, because I was a film nerd at that point too, but I kind of steered clear of the horror genre, but then I kind of dove in head first and have loved it ever since.
Lovely. Thinking of Freddy Krueger with his fingers tickling him. I'm Josephine Yanasak-Leszczynski. I have done film criticism for several websites. I have a book chapter coming out on Susan Seidelman, the director, and the Refocus series. And my day job, I'm a photo editor at a museum publishing department at the Art Institute of Chicago. My relationship with horror, I came to horror later than you. When I was 16, I saw Night of the Living Dead. And before that, I hated horror. Hated it. Hated being scared. Didn't like it. Night of the Living Dead is such an interesting commentary socially, and I had no idea. I grew up during the Eli Roth era of copying, French extremism. So it was a bad copy of a genre I already wasn't comfortable with. So I was seeing all these schlocky horror movies that didn't have as much commentary, and all of a sudden I realized, you can make a commentary. So I like that one movie. And then I never watched another horror movie for 4 years, because Night of the Living Dead was it. That was all I needed. And then in college, I started watching Takashi Miike and a lot of foreign horror, and that was it. It's in my 20s is when I really really got into horror and realizing that there's so many other things to be said with it and done with it. So yeah, it's my relationship with horror. That's how I started, at least. I feel like we're starting with how we started in horror, but you know.
Hello everybody, my name is Mack Bates. I've written for a number of publications, both print and digital, since high school, so we're talking 30 years, wow. So it's been a while. I used to be a freelance film critic for the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, for example. I also wrote for Milwaukee Magazine. That's where I met Tom. We were both co-writers for a film blog called Moviegoers that they hosted at the time. My relationship to horror started young, a little too young. My sister Kim loved Freddy Krueger, loved Jason, loved all of those slasher films in the 80s, and she had me watching them along with her when I was, a wee little tyke, and I was terrified of horror for a very long time. It wasn't really until I was a teenager, about 13, 14, where I really started to appreciate the genre a little more than I was able to when I was too young and too traumatized to really get it. I saw two films that were pretty seminal in my newfound appreciation for that genre. First, Rob Reiner's Misery in 1990, where my honorary white cousin Kathy Bates played the hell out of Annie Wilkes and won an Oscar for it, and rightfully so. And then the next year I saw Anthony Hopkins and Jodie Foster in The Silence of the Lambs, an amazing film by Jonathan Demme, which swept Oscars that year, won all the top 5 awards. And that's when I thought, okay, there's a little bit more to this, just blood and guts and gore and, thrills and frights. And I just really started to embrace it a little bit more. I can't say I'm a huge horror genre fan like these three, but I certainly do appreciate psychological horror in films that have some sort of underlying subtext and context to the thrills and chills.
I guess I should probably answer the same question about what my relationship is with horror, and it was a genre that I got fully into, I want to say, maybe late middle school, early high school, which I think for a lot of people is kind of a sweet spot if they get into the genre. Because when I was younger, very much like you, I would have nightmares and it scared the piss out of me. I was that kid that thought if I didn't hide completely underneath my blanket, something was going to grab me. Specifically, like characters like Jason or Freddy, like those were our boogeymen for me growing up, and I thought, well, if I could at least make it to 1 a.m., it's then officially morning, and nothing can hurt you in the morning. That was always my thought process.
So you were staying up till 1 a.m.?
Yeah, I would stay like wide awake until 1 a.m., being like, once it's 1 a.m., then I can uncover a little bit and actually sleep. But then later in life, I discovered John Carpenter's Halloween, and that was the movie that kind of just opened up that world for me. I was like, because I was always fascinated by it. AMC for example, would show like a Halloween marathon every Halloween, and I'd always turn it on because I was morbidly curious, but I would be riding that mute button because I couldn't handle the audio. That's what got me the worst. So I was like, well, if I'm watching it muted, it's not that bad. And then pretty much from that point on, it became a genre that I really grew to respect and love. But when I started studying film, I realized that not everyone shared my appreciation for horror. I often had teachers kind of poke fun at me, being like, oh, Mike was the horror guy. And to be honest, I leaned into that because I knew it pissed them off a little bit. So I leaned into it and just kind of made it my identity for quite a while in my life. Which brings me to, so we all have different relationships with horror. For the most part, I would say all of us are a fan to some extent. So this is a two-part question. What do you enjoy, or what do you like about the horror genre, but then what do you find frustrating about it?
I'm grabbing it.
So I was ready for this question. One thing, as we're all talking about our experiences with horror, that I love is I think all of us kind of came into horror at a young age through somebody else describing like a movie to us, like Jason or these characters. And for me, it was Candyman. My older brother told me this horrifying, and I'd never seen Candyman. We weren't allowed to watch really graphic horror when I was a kid. But he had some kid on the bus describe it to him, and then he made up a story for me about something that really happened to him, about Candyman attacking him. Like, that was true, because he broke a mirror in his room, and Candyman had come through the mirror, apparently. That's what he told me. So for years, I was like terrified of this. When they replaced the mirror, I like wouldn't look at it, I wouldn't sit in the dark with it. Like, but for me, I love that horror like incites in people these questions of like, they always want more, but it's like wanting to spread it, which I think Candyman is very much about, right? It's about spreading the horror. But the idea of wanting to share it with someone is like so powerful and so important to the horror genre. It's something that I love about it. I will say though, having been brought into horror through somebody describing a horrifying story that stuck with me. And today I love the movie Candyman because I had that very early experience. Not just because it's a great movie and the one that just came out is great. It was because like I remember my brother telling me this and feeling the chills and like how exciting that was. But something that's frustrating for me are like all of the fans, to be frank. Like fans are very challenging in this genre. I have been doing horror criticism for close to a decade, and I'm a gay femme, and that is not who traditionally talked about horror, had their viewpoint represented, or had to like project themselves into these movies forcibly. And having to talk to primarily white men about horror in the genre that they owned and they felt belonged to them for so long is hard. It's still hard. It's getting better, but Christ, it is difficult. So that's what I love talking about horror, but I hate the fans. It's just hard. It's hard out here.
Okay. What I like about horror is probably what I like about a lot of genre films. It's just such a convenient way to carry subtext into a film in a way that a lot of, prestige cinema or things that are, whatever Oscar caliber means, they don't necessarily do that. And I do feel like horror and other genres can carry those messages much more effectively and in a way that allows for, really prurient things to happen. That is fun to see, violence and sex are fun to watch on screen sometimes. But there's also this subtext that gets carried through that, and you can do it in a really, in a simple way. It can get pretty complex, and I find that, very ingratiating about the horror genre. In terms of what I don't like about it, there is an insularity to the fandom that I do think that door has been being pried open in recent years, and I do think kind of the proliferation of voices, the democratization of talking about cinema has helped that definitely. I think to some of your other questions you might ask later on, there are some drawbacks to that democratization, because some people with less of a critical apparatus or means of engaging with the material start to talk about it, but I do think it has opened the door a bit. So all of these different perspectives and viewpoints have allowed it to become much less of a white cis space, which it historically, it's looked like me. It's looked like a flannel and a beard for the longest time. I'm trying to think of, I'm going to pass it to you, Mack. I'm still stewing on what I don't like about the genre a little bit more.
Okay.
I feel like that could be a whole panel. Let's just talk about how much we hate horror. Let's change this.
Oh yeah, I can leave the charge on what I hate about horror. But what I enjoy about the genre is it's a daring, risk-taking sort of medium when you really think about it. There are a lot of things that you can tackle in horror in surprising ways. I'm looking at what Jordan Peele has done with the genre and how he's tackled race relations and intersectionality and all of these big buzzwords that people love to throw around when they're talking about the current affairs of the world. And he's doing a really great job putting his vision, putting his focus out there in a genre that people might not necessarily think you could actually do something like that in. You look at something like Get Out, you look at something like Us, you look at something like Nope, and he's got a very distinctive visual style, a very distinctive messaging style that I think is really captivating, and I'm thrilled that it's gone mainstream, because there was a time where it would probably not have been as big as it has become, as it's become in recent years. I also love that Halloween started out as a slasher flick like 40 plus years ago and has since become a meditation on generational trauma. Like, who would have ever thought that Halloween would represent generational trauma? But that's exactly what it's become. Whether you like the films and or not, that's what it represents. And I think Jamie Lee Curtis has done a really exceptional job with that character, because in lesser hands it probably would have just been some sort of horrible cliche. What I don't like about the horror genre, I came to it begrudgingly, to say the least, because I was kind of drugged into the genre, kicking and screaming, by my sister. May she rest in peace. But I'm glad that she did, because chances are I probably would have never visited it had she not dragged me into it, kicking and screaming, because I frighten easily until this day. If something like happens behind me or near me, I'm like, oh, whoa, what's that? So it's good that to kind of embrace the things that scare you, and try to stare that in the face, and horror definitely forces you to do just that. So I came into it begrudgingly, but I'm glad that I was brought into it begrudgingly, if that makes sense.
All right, so next question I have wasn't necessarily one that was planned, but it just came to me right now. So since the point of this was for people to hopefully get a better understanding of what a film critic does. Because when I was in school, because I went to school for making films, and a lot of times the film critic was often viewed as an enemy. For whatever reason, even though none of us were getting our stuff written up about, so many people just had like a negative viewpoint of a film critic, and I often believe that is because they don't understand the job of a film critic, and especially in today's world where anyone can have an opinion about a movie. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but I feel like it muddies the waters a little bit. But it also gives people an opportunity that they might not have had before. So, briefly, what would you think? What do you feel is the most important part of being a film critic, and what does your job entail?
And you can go in any order. I'm just handing it to him because he's closest.
That's a great question. And I do I do think some of what you're describing, that sort of combative nature, either between other film fans and film critics, or filmmakers and film critics in some cases, is sort of a fundamental misunderstanding of what they do. Because a film critic is writing about their experience with the film. They are not writing about what your possible experience with that film could be. Like, they're not there to kind of predict the national temperature as to how people receive this film. And if somebody's writing that way, I don't think there's a ton of value in that. They're writing specifically from their perspective, synthesizing their history and their knowledge of film with their experience of the film, and then providing you with how they feel about it. It's not how anyone else feels about it but them, and you can take that or leave it. But yeah, that's kind of how I look at that work.
Yeah, I was actually a film critic when I was going to school. I was a film critic before I went to college, while I was in college, attending film school, after I left college, So I experienced it from before, during, and after. And you bring your own personal biases to what you write. That's just the way it is. A lot of people say, oh, I try to be a blank slate when I go to see movies. No, you don't. No, you're bringing everything, your whole life experience, into that theater with you. Now, I have gone into films where I was completely cold as to what it was about, what was going to be happening, and I was pleasantly surprised in certain cases. Like, a movie that instantly comes to mind is Searching for Sugar Man. I had no clue what that was about, and I went in and it completely blew my mind, and it was my favorite music documentary that I had ever seen up until that point, and certainly one of my favorite films of that year. And so the power of cinema, really, it's engrossing, and that's what keeps you going back for more. If you're a film fan, and if you're a film critic, that also plays a huge role in it. But for me, the essential thing about being a film critic is to give people your honest assessment of a film, and hope that you influence some people in certain ways to see things that they may not have otherwise seen. I've seen movies based on people, film critics that their opinions who I trust and I respect and admire that I probably would have never seen otherwise. Siskel and Ebert got me to see movies I would have never sought out, ever. Like, I'm not gonna go at 13 and see a Merchant Ivory movie. That isn't something I'm gonna seek out, but because they say, guess what? This movie's really good. These actors are really sensational. This script, this cinematography, this directing. I sought out Howard's End, and I'm really glad I did because it's one of those movies that I truly, till this day, I go back and revisit it a lot because it's that good. And I have tons of examples of other movies that other film critics recommended to me. Foreign films, independent film. I discovered John Sayles that way. I saw Passion Fish, and I've seen everything he's done since because that's how much I love that movie. So, yeah, film criticism, it's definitely got its place. It definitely has its necessity, and I'm thrilled that even though it seems to be kind of on the weighing side now, it seems like it's trying to make a comeback of sorts, and I'm really excited about that. And I just hope that the people who are leading the charge keep doing it and keep putting their suggestions out there.
I think this panel is a very progressive view of film criticism, and I love it. In my experience, I've taken a step back from film criticism, like I'm on this panel, but I only do like one piece every 6 months now. I hate writing movie reviews. Like, I do movie essays. I can't go in a movie and then an hour later be like, here's every thought I had about it, because I got to think about it. But the publications, they need you to do it now because you're seeing it before anyone else. It's coming out midnight after you saw an 8 p.m. showing. Like, you got to do it. So I took a step back from that. But a lot of the publications I've written for, it was actually frustrating for me because they wanted either a very specific viewpoint. Like, I used to write for a website called Bitchflix, which was a really good website, but it was this very like white feministy thing, and this was like 2014, so like 10 years ago. But so that was the thing of the moment. But a lot of them now, a lot of the ones I've experienced now want me and they want my viewpoint, but they also want me to think about and approach movies objectively. And like Mack was saying, I come with a whole lifetime of experiences and attitudes about movies. And I think for film critics, the knowledge and being able to look at, like, a really good film critic watches every genre or has watched every genre, has some sense of history. And I don't believe in the whole, like, we need to put this in like the full, film legacy and understand its place in film history. But it is important to understand why this movie exists now, what influenced it. And I think that a really good film critic has their personal history and is able to interpret that in a way that is easily readable by an audience. And I agree, lots of film critics I know are constantly like making me go see movies that I would have never watched. Whether I like them or not, I always found something valuable. But I don't know, we are in a weird like changing point in film criticism, especially with the number of new voices that are coming in. Another reason I kind of stepped back is that, like, while I'm queer and femme, I'm also white, and we have so much white film criticism still that I started emailing editors and be like, don't give this to me, give this to this other person, like, let's stop. So I feel like my voice is not as needed. I'm moving more towards the academic end, which also needs a lot more diversity, but I don't need to be pumping out review after review, because like I'm gonna say the same thing every time, and everyone's like heard my opinion at this point, so.
I was just gonna jump on the back end of both of those things. I think Roger Ebert is a really good example to look at in terms of what a film critic should do, because he was a fantastic writer, like an absolutely phenomenal writer, but he had massive blind spots in what he would do, and he wrestled with them and would work with them. But like, as somebody who reads film criticism, and if you read a specific film critic, you know how they feel about things, and you can kind of take that into your opinion. So like, I'd see a movie if he didn't like it sometimes. Yep. I'm like, oh, this is a genre that historically he has struggled to see the value in. Like comedy, for instance, is something that Ebert never super got, especially like as the decades moved on. So if like if he panned like an indie comedy in a way, you could read between the lines and be like, oh, this is actually probably probably something that I'm really gonna.
It's probably actually
Yeah,
funny.
this is probably actually something
I'm gonna
that
seek
I'm
that
really
one out.
gonna
Just,
enjoy.
see for myself. Yeah.
And you know, he's also become this sort of symbol of film criticism, but people forget about like his early work with Russ Meyer and that and also like, so if Angelina Jolie was in a movie, it would get 3 stars. That was the basement for Roger Ebert review of an Angelina Jolie movie. Like, it would always at least get 3 stars. Like, he was a man
Even the
who,
tourists? No.
he was a man who like had his biases, and you like that's kind of what we're talking about, right? Like,
Yeah.
you can't help but be who you are in reviewing a film. Like, he was himself. And I just think it's funny that he's become sort of this, you know, standard bearer of film criticism, but there were some very subjective viewpoints he held and he clung to very ferociously that you can follow throughout his career that I find very enjoyable to keep an eye on.
I think part of that is because he. I think part of that is because he was the first film critic to ever win a Pulitzer for film criticism. So I think that's why he was, you know, held up to such a high standard. People like Pauline Kael have also been held to a high standard. She also certainly had her, you know,
So biased.
prejudices
Yeah.
and her biases for
Pauline.
sure. You know, and like people like Ormond White, you know, I could spend, we could talk about that all afternoon and not quite cover all of that, you know, craziness. But yeah, it's there's certainly personal biases at play, but the best film critics, you find a way of kind of bypassing some of that. Even though you just pointed out, you know, a lot of Roger's, you know, shortcomings, but you know, his pros certainly outweigh the cons. So yeah, but yeah, it is interesting that he had such a fascination with Ms. Jolie. Yes, I have to admit.
And it's funny that you mentioned Roger Ebert because he was definitely one of the inspirations behind this panel because he did traditionally like horror. There were films that he did like, that he saw something in, but it is also one of those things that Josephine, earlier you said that like sometimes horror fans can sometimes be the worst part of the genre.
Yeah.
And I am one, and I can definitely agree with that sometimes. And I follow, you know, various horror pages on the internet and whatnot. And for example, actually Ross, he had sent me an article about it's like Roger Ebert's like most scathing horror takes or something, something along those lines. And it's not the first time that I've seen that stuff shared. And it's interesting with horror fans, they will see that, you know, oh, Roger Ebert gave Friday the 13th Part 2 a terrible review. And then discredit him completely as a film critic.
Yeah.
Which brings me to my next question is, so Mack, I know actually you've all said this, but when you are a film critic, you definitely bring your own personal bias into a review. And theoretically, the reason people keep coming back to your stuff is because they like your viewpoint or they like the way that you view the world, and they want to see how you essentially put this movie through your own personal blender and what it comes out as. Why do you, with how many voices there have been in film criticism over the years, why do you think horror has been so traditionally poorly reviewed?
Oh, Josephine's got an answer.
Well, first, I just want to say I don't think there have been so many different voices
Oh, fair enough.
critically talking about film over the years. I think there's been very one-note voices traditionally. As much as I love Ebert, he was from the same group of people that were always reviewing films. Even Pauline Kael, like Pauline. But you know, she was a wealthy white woman, like Susan Sontag. Like, you know, they were all of a class, of a race, you know, of a place, New York. Like, not Ebert, I mean, I'm from Chicago, so I'm not trying to, you know, diss Ebert and Siskel, but horror, I mean, when in the history of horror movies, like I'm not gonna get into the whole thing because I think we all basically know it, but they were low budget, like movies made to make money, traditionally, and below criticism. Like they weren't, you know, worthy of criticism. And even I kind of dismissed all the movies coming out like when I was a teenager. And there's lots of good stuff there. I grew up not liking slashers. I still don't really care for slashers unless there's something different. And part of it is totally informed by having grown up in an era where a new horror movie was coming out every month because they knew teenagers were gonna, buy a bunch of tickets, buy popcorn, and make out in the seats. Like that was why movies were being made. And that doesn't mean there wasn't a lot of value there, but I think that really marred how we view horror. But I mean, the same can be said of like drama. Like I don't see rom-coms, generally speaking. I mean, now things are getting better, but rom-coms were the same thing. Like they were created to sell tickets and reinforce these terrible ideas, which I think horror does too. And there's a lot of good stuff there, and you can critically look at those things, and there's a shift happening. But I am permanently biased against rom-coms because of that. So. I just think it has to do with the history and having to reverse that. And I do think movies like Get Out, having been such a, that movie blew everyone away in ticket sales, not just in, not just in the content, how well made it was, but it was like, oh wow, like black horror can sell. Like, I mean, we've had black horror movies forever that were commenting on exactly what Get Out is commenting on, but this star director had a very successful show, brought together an amazing team, and like put all of his skills into this amazing movie, and there was surprise and audience for it. Like that will have to keep happening for the next 15, 20 years for like horror to be viewed seriously, I think. Because right now when you talk to like traditional horror, like film critics, not horror critics, Get Out was like it. They were like, Get Out was great, Nope was very fun, is what I hear a lot. Like, we know it was a great film. People keep saying like, yeah, it was fun. It's a fun movie. Because now we're back on the downward slant. It's like, Get Out was this incredible movie, we're over it. And not to mention like all of the great rape revenge work that's been done. But like, that hasn't touched nearly the numbers that the Get Out did. So we're never gonna, we're not gonna hear about that traditional criticism. But yeah, I won't keep going on.
Oh, what was the question again?
Why do you think film criticism traditionally has always been so poorly reviewed?
Yeah, Josephine, she touched on a lot of it. I think just the genre itself was never really respected because it was cheaply produced. A lot of a new talent was doing it, and so it really didn't get the respect right out the gate that something like an indie drama might necessarily get. And it's essentially the same thing. You could, give two different sets of producers $1 million. One makes a slasher film, the other one makes some, hard-hitting, Southern fried, family dramedy, and which one is going to be more critically acclaimed right out the gate, just by virtue of what it is and what it's all about. So I just think a lot of it has to do with a pedigree, where people come from, what they're used to. A lot of people don't grow up watching, well, I certainly, of Generation X and baby boomers didn't really grow up necessarily watching horror films. That's really more of a, you're like my generation, your generation, growing up watching things like that. So I think it was just a lot of that came into play. Also, a lot of the films that are made are what I like to call torture porn. And I'm certainly not a fan of, the Saws, the Final Destinations, any of, that sort of thing. I'm more into like psychological horror myself, so that's where my bias, comes into play. But yeah, I just think it has a lot to do with just the genre itself and, people's either gravitating towards it or gravitating away from it. I think that plays a big role in it too.
Sorry, I'm gonna go on for another minute, sorry. I love that you brought up torture porn, because that's totally what I was trying to describe.
Oh,
like that's,
okay.
That's what we were, and I brought up Eli Roth because they, so in Europe, I think European criticism is a little more open to horror than we are here. And I think it's 100% because films in the US are a money-making machine. Not that they are in Europe too, but torture porn, that whole, from the 2000s on, that started happening, especially with Hostel, was essentially American directors saw a bunch of French horror movies that were really graphic, very bodily distressing, but all of those were commenting on societal issues. Like, a lot of them were about race, or they were about class, or both, and American directors either picked up on that and just threw it out the window, or they didn't pick up on it and just took all the really gross stuff that was being done to people, and that's what they put in the movies. And it was totally distressing and really gross, and even if they tried to put in a little bit, it got edited out by the production companies. So torture porn totally, I would say French extremity movies are are torture porn, but they're torturous also because of who is being tortured. And the point is very much, we're doing what society does to these people on screen graphically. So like, you've already seen it, but you've ignored it up to this point. So I just love, like, yeah, like I think like, in the US, it's very hard to review horror films because, like, criticize them because they take out all this stuff that is like the meat, that is like why horror is interesting, at least until like recently.
Yeah, all I would add to that is like, the genre sort of revels in its outsider status, right? And it likes to rub people's faces in those elements that are somewhat unsavory, so it kind of does it to itself. Kind of almost like a self-policing, to get back to our point of like an exclusive club sort of thing. Like, it's a way of, you know, it's kind of like the keep out sign that the genre hangs up on its front door, because, you know, it leans into those things that people, you know, when they think of horror films, they think of body trauma, they think of a masked person, you know, chasing a scantily clad teenager through the woods kind of thing.
Or up the stairs.
Yes, always.
And the genre leans into those things because those are, like we talked about on this panel, a selling point that is going to make teenagers be like, this is what I'm going to go see, and sit in the back row and watch 20% of at the theater. So I think it does it to itself to a certain extent, but I think film, like, there's like film criticism, like writing reviews that would go in like the newspaper of record, but then there's also like film criticism, like there was really good work about the horror genre being written for many decades. It's just that it would take a broader view of the genre as a whole, or the slasher genre as a whole, and kind of, because another problem with writing about horror films sometimes, when you're writing on a film by film basis, is like, as a film critic myself, what I would do is I'd always try to like pan for gold. Like, it's really easy to write, you know, a scathing review of something, and that can be fun, but who does that benefit other than your own ego that people think you're witty and funny? So you always try and pan for those nuggets of gold in the film, and that could just be like some really righteous special effects, or, you know, practical costume work done in a horror film that is otherwise, you know, kind of disregardable. And that's in that like film by film. But if you can take a whole genre and write about it in that way, or a whole subgenre of horror, like the slasher or something like that, I do think even in an era where there was much less room for a diversity of voices writing about film, there was some really interesting stuff being written about the perspectives that those films can take. But yeah, all in all, I think the genre kind of likes to be thought of as this outsider bit because it makes money. Like, it's one of the only old reliables in a very rapidly changing film industry where like horror movies still can make a lot of money and cost very little to make. So they don't necessarily need critics to come in and champion them as works of art. Although there is sort of a tide turning to it, that elevated horror terminology, this sort of A24ification of horror, where like there is a veneer of indie prestige being put on what is like, you know, like they're releasing movies that are like Evil Dead 2, but like, since it says A24 on the front, it gets this sort of elevated horror descriptor. So
It gives a nice little gloss. Yes.
Real quick, does anyone have the time?
11:40.
All right, so we got a couple minutes before, because the next block starts at noon. And it's interesting that you mentioned, you know, the concept of elevated horror, because there's definitely a pushback against that as well. Where, you know, I've had friends myself where if, you know, I'm just going to keep using Roger Ebert as an example, if he wrote a horror review for a horror movie, they're going to go out and see it because they thought, well, if he hated it, there must be something to it. But then there's also been not only is there just a legion of people that will see anything that A24 puts out, but then there's other people who are, if they see their name anywhere near it, like, well, I don't want to see this because it's not real horror. And I felt that was kind of interesting because there's still this pushback. And what you said, that horror kind of revels in being viewed as an outsider genre. There's definitely, and I definitely had this thought process for a while when I was younger too, where when there's something you love, you don't necessarily want it to be too popular. You kind of want to feel like there's something you have for yourself.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? Yeah.
But as I've gotten older, it's like I actually much prefer I want people to see this weirdness. And probably this might be maybe the last question. We'll see. Just to kind of give people better process into the mind of a film critic. So I think it was you, Josephine. So the reason you don't do a lot of film reviews is because you don't have a really large turnaround time. You see an 8 p.m. movie, review needs to be up by midnight. How does that play into your job as a film critic? I think one of my questions I had for you was, what do you prefer to stew on a movie for a little bit, or do you think your gut reaction is sometimes your purest review? What is your process, and do you feel that lack of time kind of boils down to a more peer review, or do you think that hurts your job?
Sure. So it's not like, just to pull back the curtain ever so slightly on what that's like to do those reviews. It's not even like you go see a movie for an outlet, the credits begin, and as the credits are rolling, someone walks up to you and is like, "So what did you think?" Which is an insane way to engage with anything. There's value to your gut feeling, but I do think any writer worth their salt wants to examine why they're having that gut feeling and try and pinpoint that feeling. I do think there is an extreme talent with some critics to be able to do that turnaround. It's not something that I relish or really enjoy, being like, okay, now I have to have an immediate opinion about something. And it kind of takes a belt sander to your opinion, really, because you don't want to because you're not fully sure, where you land on it. Like, the great number of movies are not either awful or tremendous. They're in that sort of amorphous middle where there's something to say for it, but there's also a lot of things to say against it. And, having to spin things around so quickly can kind of just put you in that sort of stance, which is another, I don't love that. I like writing about films that have been forgotten about, or or being reappraised when they come out on DVD. I think that gives you more of a chance to sort of digest it and speak about it that way, because I don't super value that immediate gut feeling. I do think you want to follow that and explore it, but I think if you have to write right away, you kind of you're like, oh, that's how I felt, I'm going to take that and go from there.
Yeah, I think with horror in particular, it is easier for me to go on my gut feeling, because there's usually so much to react to if the horror film is from the traditional viewpoint. So if for instance, the movie Wauwatosa comes to mind. It's this movie about a witch that I hate. I really hate that movie, and a lot of people love that film. Yeah, I know, I tell everyone, I'm telling everyone right now again, the movie is terrible, I hate it, it sucks. But it was very much, that was easy, because I started watching it and I was like, oh, a white dude made this. I immediately, I knew who directed it, excuse me, but I was like, oh no, he did it, and I without even having looked it up, I knew that he was gonna make up some story about, oh, my mom told me a story, or I was talking to my girlfriend and then I had this idea for a movie. I knew. And that, my gut reaction was how I still feel about that movie, and that was very easy for me because I'd seen that viewpoint a million times. And that was, I did not want to spend 12 hours thinking about that movie and really dig into why I hated it. I was let me just write real quick, why this movie fucking sucks. Excuse my language. And that was great. That felt great. But when a different movie comes out, with a new viewpoint, I need to stew on it. I need to think about it, especially when I start approaching queer horror, which, it's my lived experience, but also these are new viewpoints to the genre that are finally being dispersed in a satisfactory way. So I like stewing on it, but I also, the movie like Barbie comes to mind. Like I saw Barbie in an outfit, and that's not a horror movie necessarily, it could be viewed that way. But you know, I like had my Barbie outfit, and I went with one of my friends, and we had so much fun, and we're in a theater of people who are all laughing. And the scene where like Ken is playing music at Barbie, my friend turned to me and said, "Do you have PTSD right now?" It was very funny. But like, you know, yeah, the whole theater laughed. I was like, great, now everyone knows. But it was, you know, like that movie, I saw it, it was super fun, and then a month later, I was like, I think I hated Barbie. Like, I know that's very, you know, but it took a month for me to process this very gender binary film that should have come out in like 2012, and instead was like this, you know, toy-making film that made a lot of profit. So I think that there's value in the gut feeling when you have something very clear to react against or react toward, but when it's newer, like it deserves thought and to pause and think about and place it within all of your experiences and all of your knowledge. And I prefer being able to do that than having to write a review, a quick turnaround.
My experience has been that if you have a lot of time to stew about something, sometimes your stuff comes out a little too generic. That's been my own experience. So I actually like a deadline. I like knowing that I have a finite period of time to get something done, particularly a film review. That said, I do agree with what Josephine was saying, as well as Tom. Sometimes you do need to take your time and really organize your thoughts and focus and make sure that you're trying to say exactly what it is you're trying to say. Not just, you know, blurb something out and just hope for the best and like, I think I said what I wanted to say. So it differs from film to film. Like certain movies do need a little bit more analysis and a little more, you know, time to kind of, you know, get all your thoughts, you know, and line all your ducks in a row. Other films, you can't just kind of like, there you go. You know, that was my initial take on it, and you know, and I'm sticking with it, you know, no matter what happens. So yeah, it differs from a case by case basis. But if I could get at least a day or two, that'd be great. Even if I pretty much know what I want to say, if I get more than like, you know, 8 hours, ideal. But I have had that experience where I've had, you know, a couple of weeks, and I've had as little as literally like less than 12 hours to get something done from the time I saw it to the time I had to post my review. And you know, thankfully, you know, that's what that's why it's great to have internet. Because there was a time early where I would have to type up everything on a typewriter and actually take it physically to the place that was actually going to publish it. Then they would retype it and, you know, put it in the paper. So it's great, you know, the expediency of internet when you have to really turn stuff around fast. But yeah, I think it differs from a case to case basis.
What's the time?
11:48.
11:40. Oh, yeah, I think we can ask one more question.
So to end this on a positive note,
We'll see.
Well, we'll see. We'll see. What's the last horror movie that you saw that you really liked? Doesn't have to be like new to this year. Just what's the last horror movie that you saw that you liked?
I'm pulling up my letterboxd.
So if you have an answer, you know, shout it out. And then after you say what your the last horror movie you saw that you really liked was, if there's anything you're currently working on, I want people to know about.
I'm ready.
You're ready.
That letterbox, I would not survive without it. Because I can't remember what I watched like this morning. Excuse me, I have an environmental cough. Fruit Chan's Dumplings. It's a Chinese horror movie that came out like a long time ago, many years ago. That movie rules, and I had avoided it because, I don't know, somebody like, I trust film critics, don't trust my friends. One of my friends was like, this movie is just really rough to watch. I don't think you should see it. And that movie's incredible. So yeah, Fruit Chan's Dumpling, so good, so good. Ling Bai is in it. She does a fantastic job. What I'm currently working on, I have a book coming out, Refocus, the films of Susan Seidelman. I wrote a chapter on New York. It was edited by Sue Kearns, who lives in Milwaukee and is a professor at Columbia in Chicago. So if you have a spare $85, please buy that book, or just like Venmo me $20, whatever, it's fine too. You know, whichever.
Okay, I got a confession to make. I recently got a chance to see a horror film that I had been meaning to see for years and never got around to seeing. As a matter of fact, that the entire trilogy I finally got around to seeing from start to finish for the first time. Well, actually 4 films, but I only consider the first 3 vital. The Alien trilogy. I finally got a chance to see Alien 3, and wow. I was really, really impressed. I had heard nothing but good things, and you know, was I think the first film David Fincher made that people really took notice of him as a director. And I finally got the chance to see it made. I think it was about a month ago now. And I was really, really impressed with what they did with that story. Then I went back and watched Alien and Aliens, and then I said, I'm gonna watch all three of these back to back. And I actually did. I took a weekend and watched all of them back to back after I went back to revisit the first two films. And damn, it's a good trilogy. It's a really, really good trilogy. And what I'm working on right now, I'm actually getting ready to do a stage production of a show written by Stephen Lang called Beyond Glory, where I'll be playing a Vietnam War era Vietnam War era medic. Thank you. He was a Medal of Honor. He is a Medal of Honor honoree, and of the men depicted in the show, he's the only one that is still with us. So I'm looking forward to that. That's coming up in a couple of weeks. So yes, a Vietnam War era medic. I finally said it without, dropping the ball. Here we go.
It would have been easier if you were like, what episode of Bluey did you watch that you would recommend?
I love that
I feel like
show.
I've seen a lot more of that recently than horror films. But one that I'm still like a year on wrestling with it is Halloween Ends. I will recommend that just because I do think it is a very interesting film. I don't know if it's great. I know that it's not terrible the way a lot of people felt it was terrible.
It was a big swing.
Yes, and I think we live in an era of like IP and these established properties, and I'd much rather see a filmmaker kind of take their distinctive voice and do something unique with the IP than continue on in the way that, like, to say what you will about which Scream is the most recent Scream, was it 7?
6, 7, I don't know.
Found that perfectly fine, but it's not, there is not a viewpoint necessarily being served by the filmmakers who are making that other than like a photocopy of Wes Craven's way of engaging with the genre. So, for better or worse, Halloween Ends takes a big swing. It tries to also do like this sort of takes in every element of Halloween, which is such an ungainly chronology and mishmash of genres, and like brings in some of the supernatural elements too that, rightfully some people would say have been ignored by other entries in the series, and it tries to do something unique. And I want to see filmmakers do that. So they give that little India shot. Halloween Ends.
All right, I think that is all the time we have for this panel. Thank you all very much for coming out, early in the morning too, but not that early, but still. Thank you all for coming out this morning and listening to us talk about film criticism and horror. There's a short film blog coming up right after this. I believe it's comedy horrors, so that should be a fun time for you. And then if you're around later on, I think 7:30 p.m. I have a film called No Soliciting that is playing in the Wisconsin block. So thank you all for coming out.